And welcome to Catholics Coast to Coast. The weekend means we get a chance to kick back, relax, and enjoy some downtime. And when we do that, it's always great to find inspiration and encouragement. So as we do each and every week with Catholics Coast to Coast, we give you insights into the conversations happening at Podcast Central, EWTN.com/podcast. And my name is Ace McKay, taking you on this journey as we head into this week's readings from the Mass. Let's get our check with the Word on the Word.
I am so looking forward to having a break soon. I'm off tomorrow and I'm finally going to get to catch up on sleep.
But I thought we were going hiking tomorrow.
But I need a break.
But you're the one who wanted to go.
You're right. I'm sorry. And today we're going to talk about how Jesus responded when he needed a break. This Sunday, we hear from Mark's Gospel. Let's set the stage.
Okay, John the Baptist has been beheaded, and Jesus tells his apostles that they need to go to a deserted place and rest.
They don't get much rest, though, because so many people followed them.
And Jesus was moved with pity for these people, saying, "They're like sheep without a shepherd."
When I'm exhausted and I need some time to myself, I tend to snap at people who don't deserve it. So when I think about how this reading is followed by the feeding of the 5,000, I kind of find myself in awe.
Yeah, Jesus was like, "Okay, break time, everyone." And then he willingly let people keep him from that break and performed a miracle.
This week, we challenge you to consider, how do you respond when someone interrupts your rest? And how can you learn from Christ's example?
And join us here next time. Bye.
Getting more and more inspiration from God's Word. Easy to do with our Word on the Word. Each week's Mass readings is archived when you check out Podcast Central. Go to EWTN.com/podcast or subscribe wherever you like to stream. That way you don't miss future episodes. I'm Ace McKay. As Catholics Coast to Coast continues, we're checking in with Catholic feedback as Dr. Travis Lacy is a professor of theology who, starting this fall, will be at Providence College and wanted to stop by to share the conversion story that brought Catholic faith through evangelism into his life. So we start that journey with today's Catholic feedback on this week's Catholics Coast to Coast.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to this special interview with my good friend, Mr. Travis Lacy. Travis, how you doing, brother?
Doing good. Thanks for having me, Keith. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing great. So you're a theology professor, and you used to be an evangelical.
That's right.
But now you're Catholic. And I want to get into that here because a lot of people watch this channel because they're interested in the Catholic faith or conversion to the Catholic faith. And I remember hearing a little bit of your story a couple of years ago, and I thought, man, it's always amazing to me how people wind up where they are when it comes to their faith, especially converts. So yeah. I would love to get into some of that. But let's talk about your childhood, where you were born, and what was that like for you growing up?
Yeah, so my childhood is really foundational to the story of how I became Catholic. So I was born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to two very devout, wonderful evangelical parents. So my parents raised me in a non-denominational Bible church. Now, I don't know if your listeners maybe know what that is or not, but a non-denominational church is essentially Baptist theologically. They believe generally the same things that Baptists do, but they don't belong to the denomination. They take very seriously this idea that you shouldn't have any merely human authority other than the Word of God. And a denomination would be a kind of human authority. Mm-hmm. And so a Bible church is a church that sees the Bible alone as its authority, which is even a bit more radical than even certain other Protestant denominations, right, that have denominational oversight and things like that. So I was raised in a non-denominational Bible church, and my parents really, and that church that they raised me in, really laid the foundation for the Christian faith. I was immersed in Christianity from a very young age. We went to church not just on Sundays, but also on Wednesdays, and basically any other day of the week that it happened to be open. My parents also sent me to a private Christian school where I had Bible classes.
Now, what part of the country is this?
Yeah, so Oklahoma is a part of the country.
Oh, you were down there.
Yeah, that's
okay.
right. Yeah.
That's a whole nother level of not being Catholic.
That's right. Catholics are, I don't want to say virtually non-existent, but there's not very many Catholics. I didn't know a single Catholic until I got to college. And that would obviously become important. We can get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I didn't know a single Catholic. I had heard of Catholics. I had one friend at my church whose dad was Catholic. His mom was not, and his mom, got to make the decision about which church the kid went to. But I didn't actually know a single Catholic. So Oklahoma is part of it's a part of the country that's often referred to as the Bible Belt. It's where evangelical Protestantism is really the religious lifeblood of the culture and the society. And even today, I think that's still true. So I was raised around mostly other evangelicals, both obviously at my church, but even at my school. There were very few kids at my school who belonged to some kind of denomination. Like I think I knew one Presbyterian. I didn't even know a single Lutheran, a single Anglican. They were basically all kind of Baptists or non-denom evangelicals.
So you're growing up in this evangelical household. Like, how important was your faith to your life, though? Were you someone who had your own personal experience of Christ, or was it just sort of built into the fabric of your family upbringing?
Yeah, I would say it was both. Christianity in one sense is all I've ever known. And as I've gotten older, I've grown to really embrace that and cherish it and be thankful for it. There was a time when I was in junior high and high school where I sort of resented the fact that I didn't have this really cool conversion story, because especially in evangelical circles, sometimes people can get a lot of cred, by telling some conversion story where they were, on drugs, passed out under a bridge, having just visited a prostitute, and then Jesus, like a lightning bolt from the sky, swoops in and saves them. And it's this really cool story, about how I was down at the bottom of human, I was in the bottom depths of human despair, and then Jesus swooped in and saved me. And those stories are beautiful. And I remember especially in junior high and early high school, I was sort of jealous that I didn't have a story like that. And all I could say when we would share our testimonies with other people was that, well, faith in Jesus is all I've ever known. I never remembered the moments. That's a big thing for evangelicals. For some, not all, but for some evangelicals, it's really important to know your spiritual birthday, right? The moment where you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. And gosh, I started accepting Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior when I was probably 5, right? And then never stopped, because you're not sure if it works the first time, right? And so you do it again, every now and then.
Recommitment.
That's exactly right.
We're going to do a rededication of your dedication.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So it was the air I breathed, but it was part of my experience as well, where I really did aspire to, because it was what my church and my parents encouraged me to do, was to have a real relationship with Jesus.
So in all of that, did you have any experience with Catholics or Catholicism at all? Where did that fit into your worldview?
It didn't fit at all. They might as well have been aliens. In fact, one example that I can think of how foreign Catholicism was to me, I mentioned that I went to a private Christian school, and my junior year of high school, I had this Bible teacher. So we had Bible classes. That was one of the subjects we took. I took, math, history, English, and Bible. And junior year of high school, I had a Bible teacher who I respected very much. And to this day, I'm still very grateful for him. And I owe him a lot, actually. He taught me a lot. But in junior Bible, we covered world religions. So in addition to Bible, right, you have a segment where you cover other religions. And one of the things we covered was Catholicism. And I'll never forget that one of the things that this Bible teacher, again, who I respected a lot, one of the things he told us that Catholics believed was that they believe that the Pope is infallible, but only when he's sitting in his special chair.
Yes.
And I remember just hearing that at the time, and I respected this teacher and thought, oh, wow, that's sort of crazy. And then after I became Catholic, for some reason, I remembered this. And it occurred to me then that the way he must have put this together is that he must have seen the phrase ex cathedra, which means from the seat.
Chair.
Exactly. So he must have seen this Latin phrase, ex cathedra, that means from the chair, which, in Catholic theology means speaking from the office of St. Peter, right? From the office of the Bishop of Rome, in that capacity. And he just took it literally and said, oh, there's a special chair, and when you speak from the chair, then you're infallible. This is my Bible teacher. He was an authority figure. And again, I share that not to say, oh, my Bible teacher was so stupid. Not at all. He wasn't. That's just how foreign Catholicism was. Like, we had no one to correct those misconceptions. That's how wild the kind of misconceptions were. So it didn't figure into my faith at all as a kid.
So when was your first experience with Catholics that made even just you have a different view at all?
Yeah, so that happened when I got to college. Now, I want to back up a little bit here, because when I got to college, I actually wanted to be a Protestant pastor.
Okay.
This is something that I had decided that I thought that I had discerned, and I actually did discern. I'll come back to that point in a second, but from the time that I was 14, I thought that I wanted to be a Protestant pastor. And this really started with my freshman Bible teacher. So, in another one of these Bible classes, as a freshman in high school, I was just sort of enraptured by my Bible classes, and my Bible teacher seemed to know where everything was in the Bible. She knew seemingly every verse, and it's had this absolute command of the Bible. Shout out to Mrs. Mosley. Mrs. Mosley, my
Nice.
freshman Bible teacher. I remember I would stay around after class and talk to her about the Bible, and she really encouraged me to read it more deeply. And I even was so inspired to try to read the Bible more deeply that I wanted to be able to read it in the original languages. So I couldn't teach myself Greek, but I asked my pastor, like, what do I do if I want to know the Greek word for something, but I don't know Greek? And so he hooked me up with this book. I still remember what it's called. It's by a guy named Spyros Zodhiates, great Greek name. And Zodhiates had this Greek word study New Testament where it'd have the English and it'd have the Greek with like a number system. And you could look up the number for the Greek word and it'd tell you where this Greek word was used in every verse in the New Testament. And that allowed you to kind of piece together. And you could say, oh, this Greek word is actually the same word used in this other verse. And here it has that kind of connotation. And so that's what I was doing when I was 14 in high school. And I say that not to give myself any credit, but to say that I was immersed in this environment where knowing the Bible deeply and thoroughly was really encouraged. And I took this to heart, and I discovered that I loved learning about the Bible so much and talking about it to others that I thought, well, maybe God wants me to be a pastor. This is what I enjoy doing. I seem to have a passion for it, and so maybe it's what God wants for me. And so I wanted to be a Protestant pastor. And even at that Christian school, one of the offices they had, so in high schools you have student offices, like you have a class treasurer, class president, class secretary. We had class chaplains. And one of the roles of the chaplain was to help prepare weekly chapels, which were sort of weekly little 45-minute worship and kind of message gatherings that we would have on Wednesdays. And as chaplain, it was my job to speak at chapel sometimes. And so I would give these little 8 to 10 minute devotionals, which is kind of funny to think about because in Catholicism, 8 to 10 minutes is a homily,
That's
right?
like a long sermon.
It's a homily, exactly. But in the evangelical world, that's like the kids stuff. That's the devotional, And I enjoyed doing this. I enjoyed talking about the Bible and what I was learning in the Bible to others. So I thought that I was supposed to become a pastor. I love doing this kind of thing, and kept reading the Bible very, very seriously. I tried to commit a lot of it to memory. And so when I got to college, I arrived with a pretty good sense of what was in them. I knew the Bible pretty well, even for your average 18-year-old evangelical. And again, I say that not to credit myself, but just to say that I thought that this was part of my vocation, that I needed to know it, front to back. And so when I went to Hillsdale College as a freshman, and I met a Catholic for the first time, a guy who would end up becoming my best friend there and my roommate, a guy named Eric. I remember thinking that this biblically ignorant, Mary-worshiping papist, he doesn't stand a chance against the likes of me.
You're going to convert him.
Oh, yeah, exactly, because I knew that I knew the Bible so much better than he did. And the funny thing is I was right. I did know the Bible better than he did, but that wasn't enough, right? My sort of quick knowledge in and around the various chapters and verses wasn't enough to kind of settle the arguments he would have. But it was really going to college and meeting Eric, and along with Eric, the other Catholics at Hillsdale, that where really Catholicism became a live presence for the first time in my life.
What was it about them that made you at least take the faith a little bit seriously, or take them a little bit seriously?
Yeah, it was absolutely the sanctity and the holiness of their lives. And that might sound odd because I knew sanctified, I knew holy Protestants. So it's not like being in the presence of personal sanctity was new for me. But for a Protestant, at least for a Protestant who takes their tradition seriously, Catholic sanctity is something of a scandal, and it has to be. Because if you're a Protestant who takes your tradition seriously, then it seems to me, and it seemed to me then, that you're basically obliged to believe that Catholics are constantly engaging in blasphemous and idolatrous practices. In other words, as a Protestant, it seemed to me that you're obliged to believe not just that Catholics are wrong, but that they're engaged in blasphemies and idolatries. And what that means is that they're always engaging in things that should be cutting against the grain of their own holiness, cutting against the grain of their own relationship with Christ. And so the line that was often used is that Catholics could be Christians despite, but not because of their Catholicism. But when I got to Hillsdale and I met these Catholics, I learned that was obviously not the case, that they're the Catholics who seem to show the love of Christ and the fruit of the Spirit. the most. They were the Catholics who really loved Mary, who were really invested in going to Mass daily and participating in the sacrifice of the Mass. And as a Protestant, those are the very things that you would say are blasphemous or idolatrous. And so what do you do when the things that should be not conducive to holiness are actually making you more Christ-like? That forces you to reconsider some things. And the other thing that I would say about Catholic sanctity is that it takes away the hostility. You know, in my experience, you've talked to a lot of converts, and in my world, I've talked to a lot of converts as well. Most converts go through what I sometimes call like a first conversion, and the first conversion isn't to Catholicism, it's just you take down the hostility. Hostility is really the barrier that keeps a lot of Protestants from taking the claims of Catholicism seriously, and that was true for me. That it's not just that I didn't think Catholicism was true, I was actively hostile to it. I was sort of catechized to be hostile to it. And I don't blame my evangelical upbringing for that. I don't blame them, because given what they believe, they think it's good, right? They think that in order to be truly committed to the gospel, you basically need to be anti-Catholic. But once the hostility got taken down, then you become open to a number of arguments and claims that you might not have been open to before. But hostility, in my experience, is a kind of way that a lot of Protestants keep the claims of Catholicism at a kind of arm's length. And so by knowing Catholics who were good people, who had the virtues, and who were Christ-like, my hostility had to kind of melt away. And that, you know, created an opportunity for actually becoming sympathetic to the claims and eventually to agreeing with them.
So you get to a point where when you first start, you meet these Catholics, you think they have to be out to lunch. They're hopelessly lost in terms of their theology.
Yeah.
And then you start to see their lives, and then you become a little bit more open to who they are. But maybe you feel like who they are isn't because of their Catholicism, it's despite their Catholicism.
Right.
But then there's a moment where maybe you see how that's really connected, and then something triggers you where you think now, wow, they've got something that I don't have.
That's right. Yeah, and to that, I remember feeling quite early that the saints of the Catholic Church stood a little bit taller than my heroes in Protestantism. I remember one thing that my roommate and I joked about doing. So my roommate, Eric, his great hero, his confirmation saint that he took was actually St. John Paul II. And at the time, I was really into like my John Piper phase. John Piper is a very well-known figure in the evangelical world. He wrote this book called Desiring God, and has been very influential for a lot of Christians, and has done a lot of good things for a lot of Christians and helped their relationship with God, I think. But I was really into John Piper at the time, and my friend was really into John Paul II. And he joked that, well, you know what? Our heroes both have the initials JP. So what we should do is we should put this sign on the wall with a picture of John Piper and John Paul II, and above it, it should say, JP who? You know, like which JP you going to go with? And I remember my immediate reaction to that was to say, no, we're not going to do that. Because I was embarrassed at the contrast. Like I just knew intuitively that my hero, and John Piper is a good man. I don't have any, I'm not trying to disparage him. He's not St. John Paul II. And I intuited that. I intuited that there was something about John Paul II that just stood larger, that just shined brighter, that was a bit more luminous and full. And I even got to a place where I realized by the time I was a senior in college, I realized that even though as a senior I wasn't Catholic yet, I had grown more sympathetic to it, but I was still firmly Protestant. I'm about to go to seminary. So before I started grad school at Duke, by the way, I went to seminary. We can get to that in a second. I dropped out, obviously, but I was still committed Protestant. And I remember realizing that if Eric had come up to me and said, you know what, you've persuaded me of, say, like justification by faith alone or something, by sola fide, or your position on authority, sola scriptura, so I'm going to become Protestant. I think even as a committed Protestant, as a senior in college, I would have tried to talk him out of it. Because I intuited that for Eric to become Protestant would mean a loss. Even if it meant knowing more of the truth, which is what I would have said. It's what I had to have said as a Protestant, that I possessed more of the truth than he did. There is something that he would have lost that would have been essential, that I would have like tried to talk him out of it. It would have seemed like a tragedy to me if he had stopped being Catholic. Wow. And so, yeah, I didn't have the words for it, but I definitely intuited there was a kind of fullness to Catholicism, and maybe a kind of fullness that I didn't have.
That's so interesting. I feel like there's such a powerful thing that happens when you meet a Catholic and all of your misconceptions, all of your stereotypes are blown up by seeing the Catholic life lived out in front of you.
That's right.
Because there's a lot of people who they think they know what Catholics believe and they think they know who Catholics are.
That's right.
But it's amazing to me how wrong they can be sometimes.
Yeah, I gave the example of my Bible teacher, and again, this is an intelligent, pious man. He's no dummy, but his misconception is it's laughable, right? About the Pope is only infallible when he sits in a special chair, because he didn't know a single Catholic who could correct him on this. And so if you don't actually have those personal connections, it's really easy to run with just these wild misconceptions. And in fact, having those own misconceptions overturned, this was not just a humbling, I would call it a humiliating process. Because what I would do when I first started to get to know Eric, I would try to research how I could what do Catholics believe, because I wanted to know how I could sort of prove to him he was wrong. Because what I knew was that I believed the gospel of Jesus Christ. He believed in works righteousness or some sort of man-made blasphemous system. And it was in his best interest for his own soul that I persuade him out of it. So I would research what Catholics believe, and I'd always get it from a Protestant source. And I had a few sources I would go to, and what Bible verses would you use and things like this. And I started reading Protestant kind of responses to Catholicism. I read a lot of R.C. Sproul at the time. I don't know if that's a figure you're familiar
I know.
with.
I love R.C. Sproul.
Yeah. So R.C. Sproul, in the 1990s, this group was created called Evangelicals and Catholics Together. That was started because evangelicals and Catholics, they said, well, look, we have theological differences, but we have a lot in common. And in our culture, it's especially important that we unite around our commonalities and what we share, because the culture is getting more secular. It's turning, it's becoming more and more hostile to the gospel. This is in the 90s, by the way, 30 years ago. And we need to unite around what joins us together. And so they came out with this statement about what they share in common. And it included a statement on justification. And the statement says there are points of disagreement between evangelicals and Catholics, but we do agree about all these other things. And R.C. Sproul wrote this whole book called Getting the Gospel Right, which is essentially a critique of the ECT, the Evangelical and Catholics Together Statement on Justification, because he accuses them of downplaying certain aspects of the Protestant notion, namely imputation, the idea that you're covered with Jesus' righteousness when you're justified. It's not given to you, it doesn't transform you. That's in sanctification. Justification just covers you. But the point being that I was reading stuff like this, right? I was reading these Protestant authors who were very invested in the idea that Catholicism wasn't just wrong, but a false gospel, and it is in their interest to convert them. So I started reading all this stuff, and I'd come to Eric and saying, I realize as a Catholic, you have to believe X, Y, and Z, and it's, hold up, I don't believe that. I'd have to say, what do you mean you don't believe that? This is what you believe, isn't it? And we had a lot of conversations that started out that way, of me telling him what he believed, what I thought he believed, and him having to correct me. And it would take us a while to actually argue the theology, because first he had to just correct my own misconception, right? And I had done this for so long that at the end of my sophomore year, I had this little breakdown. Actually, I think it was either his birthday or my birthday, where at the end of sophomore year, Eric was my best friend at school, and we had a really great friendship, and I had learned a lot from him. And it really struck me that the past 2 years, the way I had treated him, this guy who had become my closest friend, it was just terrible. I had treated him horribly. I came to him assuming that I knew what he believed, and that I assumed that he needed what I had to give him. And I saw him as a kind of project. I did see him it wasn't just as a project. I did see him as a friend. We had a real friendship. But I realized that I did not treat him well. And when I remember just confessing this to him, apologizing, he's my roommate, right? And so you imagine these two 20-year-old college dudes and a roommate, and I'm just telling him how sorry I am. I start break down and crying, and I end up hugging him. And I start crying on his shoulder. He's taller than me. I'm only 5'8", right? So it's easy for me to cry on another man's shoulder. So I'm crying on his shoulder, and I start crying so hard that my nose started bleeding. And when I got up, there was this blood stain on his shirt. I've always remembered that. I think he probably remembers it too. But this moment happened because I felt so convicted about how I had treated him, that I was so sure that my misconceptions about Catholicism were the reality. And because of that, I needed to fix him. I needed to clear him up. I needed to give him what I had. And so it was through this, like I said, not just humbling, but almost humiliating process that these misconceptions are broken down. Now here I just want to flag something because I think it's interesting. Fast forward a few years later when I became Catholic, one of the hardest things for me to hear was when people would tell me, when they would give these same Catholic misconceptions back to me, certain Protestants, right? And they would say, no, Catholics believe X, Y, and Z. And it was all the same things that I used to say to Eric and that I only abandoned after being humbled through hours of conversation and friendship, right? And hearing them say things like, you think you know Catholicism better because you think you know everything. And these people just had no idea that I had only come to a more accurate understanding of Catholicism through this painful, humbling process. It wasn't because I thought I knew everything. It's because I had to realize I didn't know anything, that I first got to the point that I did. So even clearing up those misconceptions, it took a lot of time and pain.
Yeah, I can relate to that. There is that moment where you have this, like these, it's like a series of revelations where it feels like the lights are starting to go on and you're like becoming aware of things that you thought you knew for sure. But once you start to see the truth of the Catholic faith, things connect in ways that you think, how did I miss that?
That's right. That's right. And that's a big thing because when it comes to what persuaded me to become Catholic, it wasn't just that I was convinced of certain positions. That happened, obviously. I changed my mind about justification. I changed my mind about the Eucharist. But it was also that the whole picture of the Christian faith started to fit together more. So one thing that happened for me, for example, was I saw that I sort of saw that Catholicism seemed to me to be more Trinitarian. In other words, the way that Catholic life was structured in the liturgy and in the Mass in particular, it was Trinitarian through and through. It was about participating in the offering of the Son to the Father through the Spirit. That's the high point of the Christian life, is being caught up into the Trinity, that eternal triune relationship of self-gift and love, of the Son offering himself to the Father, and that's what the Eucharist allows you to do, is to participate in that self-offering to the Father through the work of the Spirit. And as an evangelical, I believed in the Trinity because I knew I had to, but the pieces didn't quite connect. I couldn't quite connect the doctrine of the Trinity to my day-to-day life, at least not very well. I couldn't quite connect the Trinity I couldn't quite explain why the Trinity mattered. It was true, the Bible teaches it, therefore you need to believe it. But Catholicism seemed to me Trinitarian top to bottom. The whole thing was about participating in the triune relations of the Godhead. And you know what's interesting about that, though, Keith, is that I only cared about living a Trinitarian life because I had a youth pastor back at my non-denom Bible church who emphasized that. He would always encourage me to try to think Trinitarianly, right? To see how our belief that God is triune, Father, Son, and Spirit, this eternal communion of self-gift and love and glorification, that changes everything because that's our God. Right? If the Christian faith is ultimately about the kind of God we believe in and what God has done for us, believing in the Trinity should change everything. And this youth pastor, a very, very wise man whom I owe a lot, he was always encouraging me, like, be a Trinitarian Christian, right? Don't be a Unitarian. You're not a Unitarian. You believe in a Trinity, that God is a communion of self-giving love. And that fit far more deeply and neatly and profoundly into Catholicism, I saw. But the point is that I only cared about that because I was taught to care about it from my evangelical Bible church. They had laid the kind of foundations. It's like they had given me puzzle pieces that were great puzzle pieces, but they only fit in the kind of larger Catholic framework, if that makes sense.
Dr. Lacy explaining why he had to become Catholic as we got a chance to check in with the Catholic feedback. For more on this conversation, go to Podcast Central at EWTN.com/podcast and make sure you subscribe wherever you like to stream. That way you don't miss future episodes. I'm Ace McKay as we continue with Catholics Coast to Coast. After the break, Living the Call, talking with Rebekah Weigel, who is the writer and producer of The Sound of Hope, which is the story of a small church community in Possum Trot, Texas, who banded together to adopt 77 children as they took a look at the local foster care system. We'll get more of that story coming up with Living the Call next on Catholics Coast to Coast.
If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
Rebekah Weigel, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it. You've gone and created quite a little film here, Rebekah. I got a chance to see it. It's super special.
Thank you. It was, my husband and I worked together, so we're partnered. We're a team. He directed, and then we wrote and produced together. So.
Well, I can definitely see the sort of the fullness of a married couple working together. There's something about it, about the film. It's a sense of sort of completeness. There's really good writing in it. I know you wrote it and produced it. There's a couple of lines in particular that stood out. We'll kind of talk about them. But the kind of most important thing for me, especially as someone who is deeply involved in the area of foster care. I am an adoptive parent, working with homeless kids, involved in the issue of human trafficking. It's a particular film that I think touches on a number of very important thematics and does it in a way that's relatable. Obviously, you guys, we're talking on July 1st. Movie comes out on July 4th. I know Angel Studios is trying to, strike lightning twice. July 4th open, Sound of Freedom last year, Sound of Hope, which is your movie, The Story of Possum Trot this year. Give us a little bit about kind of the background of how this got started.
Yeah, it kind of started actually in 2013. We adopted 2 of our children, and that process just really moved us to start really caring about this issue. We had another project that we were working on, and we honestly just decided to put it on the shelf and focus on the kids. Just felt like that's what God was calling us to do, and it was such an important story. And, to have 22 families, this little church, step in and adopt 77 of some of the hardest to place children in the Texas child welfare system, and to do it together as a church, it just inspired us, inspired our family to really elevate this community and show what's possible through the power of the church.
That's awesome. The film is really well crafted too, which is important because, and people who hear this show know that I'm constantly on about the qualitative difference between Christian media and secular media, because there tends to be a pretty big chasm. But this film is directed beautifully. So give your hubby congrats, small congrats on my part. Really well done. Great use of foreshadowing. Really well acted too. Demetrius Gross, Nika King. Is it Diana or Diana?
Diana Babnikova.
Who the heck is this woman? Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Man, she killed it.
And, she's from the UK. So she did an American accent. She was only 13 and just nailed it. I mean, she's fantastic. And we loved working with her as well.
Yeah, she pulled off East Texas really, really well. But no, it was a super well crafted movie and very well told, and just a lovely series of moments in it. For me, anyway, both about the idea of this sort of crazy mission to try to do something about a very real issue, and also the honesty about the very real challenges that exist when you do, right? One of my favorite lines that you wrote in this was about it doesn't matter how things are going, right? At some point, the Child Protective Services person is checking in on mom and dad who have adopted a couple of kids or fostered a couple of kids. And she's like, how's it going? Is it okay? Are we progressing? And the character of the reverend, of the bishop, responds, it doesn't matter how things are going. And so I love the honesty of how, we're all called to do stuff, and we look at things from a kind of a linear standpoint. They have to get better every moment, but that's just not reality. And sometimes it's really hard. And that's part of the journey.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we wanted to show that it was challenging, and that's what inspires people. Is I think we all know that foster care and adoption is challenging. So why try to sugarcoat it and pretend like it's not? But we're called as people of faith to do hard things. And it's very clear that it's our faith that compels us to action. So this community just in faith stepped out of their comfort zone, even though their lives were not really easy. I mean, this couple had a special needs son already, and they were trying to lead a church. They didn't have a lot of resources. And it really shows us that we can all do something, that we can all step in. Because I think, if we're honest, we all think our life is overwhelming and we have too much on our plate. And, and it keeps us from really doing the important things a lot of times because we wait until the perfect timing. And that was our story for a long time as well.
Personally, your story.
Yeah. I mean, we always had a heart to foster and adopt. From the time my husband and I got married, we had talked about it. But when life goes on and you just get busy and you have kids and, you have bills and you just start thinking someday down the road, my life will be easier. It'll be more stable. I'll be more ready. And I just don't know if that's the reality. I think a lot of times God's calling us to step out now and trust him that he's going to provide for us and he's going to give us what we need.
Yeah, it's the mirage of the future and the mirage of the past. But scripture is super clear. Now is the acceptable time, right? We only have this moment. That's the reality. But it's a very human thing. Done it myself, did it with my wife, kind of put off these great things. I wonder if you had the experience, that we did, certainly with fostering, where as people would find out about your story and, we've fostered or we've adopted, people would respond, "Oh, that's awesome. Like kind of good for you." Right. But in a way, it always struck me as kind of curious because it meant like it wasn't something that was good for them. It was like, there's only certain people that do this.
Exactly. I mean, I think, people oftentimes put you on a pedestal when you step in to foster and adopt and treat you like you're special, you're heroes, and you're not. I mean, I know our family wasn't. I mean, we felt ill-equipped a lot of times and unprepared and not ready. And, we didn't have a lot of time. I mean, all the things that everyone else feels. And so just because we said yes doesn't make us special. I think more of us are called to say yes. And it's really hard in America because we're told, life is supposed to be comfortable and, I don't know. I think we a lot of times value our comfort and value our peace, what we consider peace, when really God's like, but I want to equip you and I want to change you in this process. So come and follow me. This is where I am. I'm in the low places and I'm with these children. And when you fight for the kids, you tap into what he's doing in his heart. And there's so much fulfillment in it.
There is. And that's the thing we forget about a lot is this idea of the two-way street, right? It's like we think even we can convince ourselves sometimes. It's like, I'm going to do this good thing for someone else. And there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes we forget that God uses every instance to work on us too. So there's something to learn. There's something to gain. There's something to be nourished by. There's something to be formed by in these interactions. And if you kind of put them off, you're going to, miss them or can. And just in the film, one of the things that really struck me, by the way, you brought me right to the letter of St. James that I hadn't read in a very long time, but it's quoted a few times, which I thought was really interesting. But you talk a lot about how the burden, a weight, is sort of eased by it being carried by a lot of people, right? This sort of beautiful image that it's really about how we can kind of come into community. Yes, you are going to experience difficult things, especially if you get on these paths. But if you do it and you share that burden, then you're able to do greater things and move, heavier objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we've lost that a little bit, at least in some of our churches. I see that in Bennett Chapel. I mean, we were able to move our family here to Deep East, Texas and be part of the Bennett Chapel community and church. And they do that, they bear each other's burdens. They're there for one another. I mean, there's this strong community aspect that, I never experienced until we moved here and we were part of their community, but I long for it. And I think we need that. And I think it's very biblical. If you look at the Bible, of bearing one another's burdens, we're called to be a family, the family of God. So family is there for each other in the thick and the thin. And, that's who you call on when no one else will come and help you. And that's really what we're called to be as believers and as the church.
It's you hear so many things and intellectually you understand them, but it takes story and art to move your heart to sort of feel them, right? And that's very similar to what you just described. When I was watching your film, I got this idea that, wow, it really is not enough for, say, me as a minister to preach a sermon and move someone to a kind of closer understanding of Jesus or God or the Trinity or whatever. It really is, that's part of it, but it's not enough, right? And these people are sitting in a group and in a community in front of me, or I'm part of them for a reason. And if we're not living that community out, right? If we're not really working with one another, helping one another, carrying each other's burdens, then we're missing a big part of what this is. It's not coincidence that we're all in the same building together. It's like hundreds of people together. But I have a tendency, and I think maybe us as Americans also have a tendency of being very kind of individualistic about stuff, even our faith, or it's like, okay, we're in the same building, but like, that's all we have in common. It's like, no, it's more than that.
Right. That's so true. And I don't know if that's kind of an American thing. I have noticed that, in communities where they have more resources, we lived in an area of Los Angeles that was, a nice community. And I remember so clearly, like, asking one of my friends for help one time. I was, got stuck in traffic and needed help picking up one of my kids from school. And my friend says, she's like, I have a nanny for those things. Like, and she sends me the number for like the nanny that she hires to pick up when she's in a bind, And so it really struck me. I mean, at the time it was really hurtful. I was like, oh, can't you just help me? But I think there's a different mentality. It's like, you need a ride to the airport, we'll get an Uber. Like, why would you ask me to do that? I'm busy. Whereas in communities where maybe they don't have as many resources as far as financial resources, they really depend on each other. And so I think we're kind of missing out when we don't have that tight-knit community, because there's something really special about someone cares enough to take time out of their schedule to go help you with something.
Preach it.
Just,
I mean, I
hire a nanny.
think another way of describing it is sort of this idea that we're very transactional instead of relational now, right? It's like, and part of that may have to do with where you live, where things are more accessible in maybe urban areas versus other ones. But I'm not sure. I think, as I was watching your film, I got the sense there's a scene. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. This show, just so you know, Rebekah, will come out right before the movie premieres. So hopefully we're not giving away too many things. People should go see the movie. But there's a scene where one of the characters kind of goes missing, goes AWOL, and the entire community gathers to go look for them. And I was thinking about, it's like, it feels like a time machine. It feels like that's something people did 100 years ago. It doesn't really happen now. But if you really interrogate that thought, you're like, well, why is that? What is that about? It's because we've sort of, entered this kind of transactional reality where it's like, oh, I just hire someone to do that, or there's a service to do that, or there's a government agency to do that. This sense of, it's someone else's job, which I think is a big thematic of your film. Is it's like, it kind of turns the mirror on us and it's like, wait a minute, what are you doing? What are you doing about this?
That's so good. I think that was a big part of our goal is, especially when it comes to child welfare. I think as people of faith, we know that, our faith compels us to do this work, and that it's clearly in our scriptures to do, care for the orphan, care for the widow, care for the vulnerable. But oftentimes we leave it to nonprofits to do that work, or to an agency, or to the government. And we just withdraw and think, well, I wrote a check, or but it's not going well that way. I mean, there's a line in the movie that says the state ain't no family.
Yep.
Yes, and it's true. It's like
I wrote that one down. That was a particularly good one. The state ain't no family.
Yes, and we as believers believe in family. I mean, we are part of the family of God. He loves family. He created family. I believe healing comes in the context of family, and bringing children into our families is where they can truly find healing in the context of safety and family, in a healthy family.
Rebekah, where did if you go back and think of your desire for a deeper understanding and proximity to the issue of children needing and desiring a home, where was that born? I mean, obviously the Holy Spirit gave birth to that, but where did you, when did this become something so powerful for you?
I think it's when I truly committed my life to the Lord and just decided to follow him, and reading the scriptures and just knowing that this is the heart of God. And if it's his heart, then it should be my heart. And I think his people should love children and be so concerned that there are children out there without families. I mean, we have 100,000 children in the foster system who don't have loving families and literally are just waiting for people to come and say, I believe in you. There's hope for you. I know you're a gift, and I am going to sacrifice my own comfort to bring you into our family. Even though it might be uncomfortable for me for a season, or even though it might, cause my biological children and not have as much money or attention, or they have to share the room, whatever it is, we believe in you. And I think as the church, we've done a really good job of being pro-life and fighting for life. But I think we've stopped short.
Yeah.
We haven't accepted the fact that these children that are in the foster system are our modern day orphans, and they are worth fighting for. And sometimes it's fighting for them to stay with their biological families and to reunify. And that's amazing and beautiful as well. But there's so many that already have their rights terminated and are just sitting there languishing. And 20,000 are aging out of the foster care system every year without a family. And that has been devastating to society.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they end up trafficked, they end up, incarcerated. All of these things that we see happening in our culture could be eliminated, really, if we focused our efforts on the root, which is God has called us to care for the most vulnerable.
Amen. And by us, he means you. It's not us, this amorphous blob of people we don't know. It means you and me and you and me, and point at them. And that's what the us means. You said something really important there a moment ago in terms of this sometimes reunification with their family, because I think what your film also does, or this story does, of Possum Trot, is that it illustrates the fact that two things can be true at the same time. Okay. One thing that's true is parents deserve to know and, frankly, be with their parents, to know their family, to know who their parents are. And yes, that's true. However, there are those circumstances where, for 1,000 reasons, a lot of them, frankly, in my work, I've never come across one that isn't somehow related to trauma. But in some cases, in a number of them, that unification or reunification is not possible. And there's a real human being that needs to be cared for throughout that period of time. And you brought that idea to light by the CPS character. There's a woman who works for Child Protective Services in the film. And in a lot of times where I've seen this done, it's usually that person's either the bad guy or the good guy, but it's never this sort of working with the other either the church or the nonprofit or whatever. But I thought you guys gave a real human face to that character and to that reality that a lot of those people, live. And so you were able to relay this idea that two things can be true at the same time, right? It's like family's good and, reunification, all that stuff. But at the same time, we've got this other reality, and we have to contend with, those hundreds of thousands of kids that need help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we tried our best. I know there's so many complexities with the foster care system that, is difficult to touch on everything. And this is clearly an adoption-related story because this particular church said,
Yeah.
send us the ones no one else will take. So they were sent the ones that weren't, the plan wasn't reunification for the kids in Possum
Yeah.
Trot. They were already, rights were terminated. It was not, they needed adoptive placements. And so, you know, we need both. I mean, we need missional families that see the need and will really put the needs of the children first. They're not trying to just grow their family. They're not trying to just do something good that makes themselves feel better, but really are going to fight for children and going to protect the needs of vulnerable children. And if that's the best thing for them to go back to their biological family, they fight for that. They pray for that. They help facilitate that. But they have open hands waiting that if God's saying, no, I want you to provide a permanent loving home for this family, for this child, then we're willing to do that. And it's whatever is best for that child.
What practical like advice, either from your own life or as a result of making this movie, do you give to couples or I don't know, maybe even individuals, but that you share with people about the reality of this kind of mission or this ministry, like how they can be a part of it? Like, how do you talk about that?
Well, I did foster care recruitment for a number of years in Los Angeles before making this film, and actually worked with, I mentioned, the Catholic Archdiocese in LA, and was working to recruit families from the faith community. And you know, so I talked with a lot of families, and I think something that I think it's important for people to know is it's very normal for the wife to get the vision first. Like almost every family I talked to, the wife's heart was just breaking for this issue and for kids. And the husband was like, whoa, she's crazy. You know, she can't even handle her own kids. I don't know how many times I heard that. And I was like, I'd pull the husband aside and say, don't worry, every husband feels that way. So whether we have
true.
1 kid or 5 kids, we're still crazy and it's still overwhelming, you know? And so I think a lot of times we think, well, I'll wait till I feel like I have it all together. And I would just encourage people. I mean, you do need to have some things together. If your life is a complete mess and your marriage is, you know, about to fall apart, like probably not the best time. But, you know, if there is practical things, but there's also not everyone's called to foster or adopt. And I don't say that lightly because I think people use that to let themselves off the hook a lot. And I think more of us are called to step in and foster or adopt. I think it should be the culture of our church and the churches is this is who we are.
Absolutely.
This is our identity. Like you step into a church and you're going to see families of all different ethnicities and you're going to see them caring for kids and loving kids and supporting families. And, you know, I think that should be the norm. But I would also say if it isn't the right time right now, find a family in your life who is doing it and wrap around and provide support and practical help for them. Let them go out on a date night, you know, send them to dinner, tell them you're praying for them. You know, I worked with one church in LA that I loved that had their foster and adoptive families up on the wall at the church, like with their missionaries, you know, it's like missionary so-and-so to China or, you know, and then it was like, you know, this family is a foster adoptive parent in LA, like pray for them. And I was like, wow, that's really cool that, you know, some churches see this as such a ministry. And I think that we should look at it like that.
What do the people, you said not everybody's called to this. What are legitimate concerns or I guess versus maybe illegitimate ones that you hear when you bring this up? What do people say? Like, what are some of the sort of initial objections?
I think most people feel concerned about their own biological children, that they're not going to have enough because all of us as parents feel like we're not doing a great job. I mean, most parents feel like they could be doing better with their own children. I could be giving more time. And so you already feel a little spread thin. So how could I add more children into this? It could take away from my biological children. I think that's one of the top concerns I hear. And I would just say, I mean, at least for my own children, I think it's been really good for my kids to not have the world focus around them. And for them as a family with us as parents to be able to walk alongside and be part of the healing, because that's what we want to see our kids learn is how to live out the gospel practically, how to love people even when they might be hurting them or taking their toys or breaking things, how do you learn to love? And how do our kids learn to love if we completely shield them and protect them from any kind of difficulty or challenge?
Another amazing story reminding us of how to care for God's children. You want to hear more of Living the Call? Check it out. Podcast Central at EWTN.com/podcast. And remember, at Podcast Central, even outside of this week's Spotlight, we've got hundreds of conversations to help deepen your walk with God, and even daily saints, daily devotions, things that can really help you dive deeper into God's Word this summer. So check that out, and I'll see you again next week. I'm Ace McKay, reminding you to let God define who you are, and we'll see you again on Catholics Coast to Coast.